If you've ever been to a hospital or know how to read, you can thank the medieval Catholic Church. Most of what you've heard about the medieval church, at least if you grew up in the US, has probably been extremely negative. They burned people at the stake, they shook people down for money, they suppressed learning and kept Europe in the Dark Ages until Martin Luther brilliantly flipped them the bird and changed the course of history forever. While some of this is certainly true, there have been layers of fabrication that have built up over the centuries that make it difficult to separate fact from fiction. While I don't intend to defend the medieval Catholic Church from historical accusations of corruption and greed, which were made with good reason, I do intend to point out the impact the Church had on social progress and structure in Europe and eventually the world. So that brings us to today's video. We're going to talk about how the medieval Catholic Church preserved and developed civilization in Europe throughout the Middle Ages, giving us so many of the ideals and institutions that we take for granted today. Believe it or not, the medieval church was instrumental in the preservation of knowledge in unstable times. It was responsible for the first universities and hospitals and charity houses in Europe, and it acted as a failsafe against the tyrannical impulses of the most power-hungry medieval monarchs, although sometimes the Pope got a little power-hungry too. The church's importance was recognized and very much respected in the Middle Ages, but the intervening centuries haven't been kind to its historical record. For the sake of this video, let's forget all that and travel back through the ages to medieval Europe to find out the truth about the church and dig up what has been so carefully buried over time. We first find ourselves sitting across the table from a tall, bearded man whose large eyes and long nose are framed by the thick white hair that hangs down around his face. He speaks to us in a soft voice, but there's this undeniable fire in his eyes and a magnetism that has us hanging on every word he says. Royal documents and church records refer to him as Carolus Magnus, but we know him today as Charlemagne, the king of the Franks and the first Holy Roman Emperor. Charlemagne united Western and Central Europe for the first time since the fall of Rome and ushered in the Carolingian Renaissance, a widespread revival of learning and culture that was sourced heavily from, surprise surprise, monasteries and cathedral schools. You're probably wondering how he fits into this video, and that's it right there. Here we have the single most significant figure of the early medieval period respecting church authority and working within its confines to promote the maintenance and spread of knowledge. In his Admonitio Generalis, issued at Aachen in 789, Charlemagne ordered that monasteries and cathedrals establish schools to educate boys in reading, writing, chant, and religious texts. He emphasized that correctly copied books, especially scripture and liturgical works, be made available to students. The Catholic Church not only helped Charlemagne in achieving his educational mission, it was essential in carrying out the reforms that he saw as so important. Under this system, monks and clergy became the school teachers, and Charlemagne brought in leading churchmen like Alcuin of York and Theodulf of Orleans to organize and supervise the schools. It was Charlemagne who implemented the reforms, yes, but it was the church that built the system that actually made it happen. This type of arrangement became par for the course, with the church acting as a cornerstone of essentially all educational development in medieval Europe. 100 years after Charlemagne, Alfred the Great of England noted the decline of learning in his realm and set about trying to revive it. Alfred was this pious king, and he had a great respect for knowledge and for the church. He wanted to promote education in England and establish Old English as a written language, so he personally translated Pastoral Care, a work written by Pope Gregory, into his mother tongue. He chose Pastoral Care because it was a guide for bishops and priests on how to lead their flocks, and by extension for kings on how to rule justly. Alfred sent copies of his translation to every bishop in the kingdom as part of his literacy and moral reform program, a program that happened through and was supported by the church. That's an important piece of information. Alfred recognized a widespread lack of education and literacy in his kingdom and chose to utilize the church as the institution to solve this problem. This highlights a key aspect of the medieval worldview, which was that the church was seen as a beacon of knowledge and progress and was relied upon as such throughout the Middle Ages. So far, we've seen what it looks like for kings and popes to work together, but what about when they clashed? When most people think of medieval politics, they picture all-powerful kings with massive armies who crush their enemies and answer only to God. But one of the most revolutionary aspects of medieval Europe was that kings weren't actually all-powerful because there was someone above them, the Pope. One of the church's earliest and most effective attempts to curb violent tyranny, especially from local warlords, came through the Peace of God and Truce of God movements. Beginning in the late 10th century, bishops across France convened councils to prohibit violence against vulnerable populations like peasants, clergy, women, and children. These decrees were often proclaimed at public gatherings attended by thousands, where knights swore solemn oaths before holy relics to uphold them. The peace of God forbade attacks on non-combatants, while the truce of God later restricted when violence could be committed, typically banning fighting from Wednesday evening through Monday morning and during major liturgical seasons. These movements had real teeth. Violators were excommunicated, ostracized from Christian society, and denied burial in consecrated ground. While enforcement varied regionally, the very idea that the church had authority to regulate violence and protect the powerless was revolutionary. In an age before standing armies or centralized police, these ecclesiastical declarations served as one of the only forces capable of restraining feudal brutality. Councils like those held at Charroux, Toulouse, and Arles reflected the church's early attempts to impose a moral code on the strong, binding even the most unruly nobles to a higher law. The conflict between Pope Gregory VII and Emperor Henry IV in the 11th century, known as the Investiture controversy, was a major turning point. Henry had tried to appoint bishops loyal to him, effectively treating the church as part of the state. Gregory responded by excommunicating him. In 1077, Henry traveled to the Pope's residence in Canossa, stood barefoot in the snow for 3 days, and begged for forgiveness. Why? Because excommunication didn't just bar you from Mass, it meant no Christian could serve you, fight for you, or swear loyalty to you. This was a profound check on political power. The Pope, by asserting spiritual authority, placed limits on royal absolutism. And this wasn't just a power grab, it was the outgrowth of a church that saw itself as a moral authority, a defender of justice, law, and conscience. The development of canon law, codified in Gratian's Decretum around 1140, reinforced these boundaries. Ecclesiastical courts operated independently of kings. Clergy and lay people alike could appeal judgments to Rome. The church created a parallel legal structure that became the template for modern ideas like due process, universal jurisdiction, and the supremacy of moral law. Pope after pope issued statements condemning unjust rule, often at great personal risk. During the 14th century, for example, Pope Boniface VIII clashed with King Philip IV of France over taxation of the clergy and papal sovereignty. In the bull Unum Sanctum, Boniface declared it is absolutely necessary for salvation that every human creature be subject to the Roman pontiff. While controversial and politically explosive, this document reaffirmed the papacy's role as a moral check on kings, even to the point of martyrdom. Boniface was kidnapped and beaten by Philip's agents for his defiance, dying shortly after his release, but his stand set a precedent. The church had a duty to speak truth to power, even if it cost the Pope his life. Now, the church wasn't just limited to promoting education or putting boundaries on the power of kings, it also promoted healthcare, or at least what people in the Middle Ages thought of as healthcare. You can go all the way back to the Rule of St. Benedict, composed in Italy in the 6th century, which was a guide that was adopted by Benedictine monasteries in the Middle Ages and which ended up being hugely influential on Catholic practice. The Rule of St. Benedict emphasized caring for the poor and the sick, insisting that tending to the needy was a sacred duty of monasteries. Here's a little excerpt if you don't believe me. The care of the sick is to be placed above and before every other duty, as if indeed Christ were being directly served by waiting on them. We all know that it's one thing for a principle to be written down somewhere and another thing entirely for people to actually practice it, but medieval monks and nuns did just that. Their abbeys ran infirmaries, hospices, and almshouses that eventually transformed into the first hospitals in Europe, established purely as acts of charity. I feel like this is the perfect time to talk a little bit about the Knights Hospitaller, one of the most interesting Catholic institutions in the medieval world. Their official name was the Order of St. John, and they were founded in 1048 in Jerusalem before the First Crusade by a group of Christian merchants from Amalfi. One of their first orders of business was to establish a hospital near the Church of the Holy Sepulchre to care for poor, sick, and injured pilgrims, with Benedictine monks as the caretakers. After the First Crusade was over, the Knights Hospitaller gained formal recognition as a military religious order by Pope Paschal II, but while they were technically allowed to bear arms, their primary mission was care of the sick and poor. By the 12th century, they had set up an absolutely massive hospital complex in Jerusalem, which was capable of caring for over 1,000 patients at a time, a massive step up from what was available in most of Europe. These hospitals were shockingly modern in how they operated, with separate wings for different genders and conditions, dedicated surgeons and physicians who were well educated and well trained, and a policy of offering treatment to all, including Muslims. After the fall of Jerusalem, the Hospitallers relocated to Acre, then Rhodes, then Malta, and the advances they made in medical infrastructure slowly expanded into the rest of Europe and brought healthcare into the future, all fueled by the support of the church and the spirit of Christian charity. So let's land the plane here. Yes, the medieval church had its failings. Inquisitions, political corruption, crusades that went off the rails. But step back and the picture is undeniable. When Rome fell, the church stayed. When warlords rose, the church resisted. When ignorance threatened to consume Europe, the church held fast to the written word. It taught children, healed the sick, fed the poor, and limited kings. And it created the framework from which our modern institutions, schools, hospitals, courts, and even universities would later emerge. As historian Thomas E. Woods writes, the Catholic Church built Western civilization. Not alone, not perfectly, but without it, there might not have been a civilization left to build on. So the next time someone dismisses the Middle Ages as dark, remind them medieval Catholicism didn't just save souls, it saved the world. I'm John, and this has been Medieval Mindset. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos on medieval history, and remember, the past isn't gone, it's just waiting to be rediscovered.